Hi, I'm Virginia Spielmann. I'm the Executive Director here at STAR Institute for Sensory Processing Disorder in Greenwood Village, Denver, Colorado.
And I'm Dr. Lucy Miller. I'm the Emeritus Director or Faculty Emeritus of STAR Center. I had Virginia's position before Virginia.
And my name is Sarah Schoen. I am the Director of Research at the STAR Institute for Sensory Processing Disorder, having worked for years under the mentorship of Dr. Miller. So happy to be here. Thanks.
And I'm mostly just delighted to be here as well. And today we're really excited to be talking about, what we think is going on in the world of sensory processing. We feel like there's some really great things happening right now. It's 2019, we're looking ahead to the future, we're doing a lot of vision casting, and we have been thinking about some of the progress that's been made and what we think we're looking for going forwards. And one of the things was just where we've come from, wasn't it?
Right. I think when you're thinking about going forward, you should start with where we were.
Mm-hmm.
And sensory was in the 50s, when Dr. Ayers was working in the 50s, when she had her postdoc at UCLA, she did some amazing, brilliant studies that were so forward-thinking. They were so ahead of her time. The interesting thing about it was she projected things that we now can do because we have the instrumentation that we couldn't. There was no fMRI. There was no multisensory integration labs. So she knew from the literature, from a careful examination of the literature, many of the constructs that we've now have shown to be true. So that was in the 50s, and things evolved along, and now we're at a place where sensory used to be a word that was not spoken. It wasn't an everyday word. And I can remember when we were first funded, that feeling that nobody had ever heard of sensory before, and everybody had heard of autism, but nobody had heard of sensory. It wasn't in the papers, it wasn't in movies, it wasn't in TV, and now sensory is everywhere.
And your first funding, Lucy, came from the Wallace Research Foundation, right? Henry Wallace was really the stimulus behind launching this body of work that you produced.
My first funding for sensory.
Yes.
Yes, 1994.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how that came to be.
Do you remember Judy Reisman?
I remember the name, of course.
She was director in Minnesota of the OT department, and she somehow met Henry Wallace, and he was trying to find somebody who was interested in studying sensory integration. You would think there would be 1 million people interested in that, right? But he couldn't find anybody. I think they turned to me because they knew of my history developing tests.
Mm-hmm.
And so they thought of me as a scientist in OT. And I talked to Henry, and he said, yeah, you have some good ideas. What would you like to study? I'm like, I don't know, what would you like me to study? And he's like, you can study anything as long as it's empirical, it's scientific, and it explores new territory. I said, well, that sounds good. Are we talking about a little study here? Or he called me on the phone. I'm sitting in my office talking to this guy about doing some revolutionary research. And he said, well, you can decide. We don't want to have anything to do with the conceptual pieces, but we'll fund you. It's November. We have $70,000 left this year, but we'll get more next year. So think about a project that would be in that range. So I went down the hall, talked to Rondi Hagerman, and we came up with the Sensory Challenge Protocol, which is well known now. A number of people have replicated it. You've been involved in it.
Yeah, well, and it really was revolutionary. It really brought physiological research to occupational therapists. It utilized physiological measures to look at reactivity to sensation. And I think that hearing you talk about it made me have that perspective that although Ayers, of course, came from her scientific research background, the field was moving of sensory integration into such a clinical domain that it had to be reined in for that research foundation to continue to grow and develop. And that was the beauty of the seed money that I think Henry Wallace provided, which allowed you to grow and expand and share this passion for understanding the sensory domain across multiple clinical disorders.
So Thomas Kuhn, who we were talking about earlier today, says that in order for a paradigm shift to happen, you have to move from the clinical to the empirical.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what you're
that's
talking
right.
about.
Yeah, it's so true.
So Thomas Kuhn wrote the book Structure of a Scientific Revolution about 50 years ago, about the same time as some of this other stuff was happening. And what he really, many people haven't heard of him because the name isn't very popular, but most of us know the phrase that he coined, which was about a paradigm shift happening. Mm-hmm. And so about 2015, I remember having this feeling that we were on the cusp of a paradigm shift in the way that we supported human beings. Right? Those individuals on the autism spectrum, people who have sensory processing challenges as a standalone condition, people with attention deficit disorder,
Traumatic brain disorder,
right.
OCD, many.
Anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
and it just, I had this sense, and I remember talking about it at a conference, that when the tide turns, there's a moment of stillness right before it comes back in. And when you throw a ball in the air, there's that moment before it comes back down. And I remember saying, I think we're there, I think we're in that moment. And then in the years since then, some quite subtle but really profound changes have happened in some of the literature from other areas, non-occupational therapy researchers, people who have changed the course of their own research are converging, and sensory processing is a thing. It's recognized now. It's referred to as just, it's a given, right? In the Academy, the Pediatric Academy document last year, Caroline Robertson and Simon Baron-Cohen's article about autism.
Just the RDoC alone, adding in the sensory motor
Huge.
piece, as well as the recognition of the individual sensory domains.
So that's NIH.
NIH, yes, exactly.
What's NIH?
The RDoC that she was talking about.
What is it? It stands for the National... Yeah.
Oh, well, the RDoC stands for the Research Documentation Criteria for National Institute of Mental Health.
So a huge driving force behind the direction research is going to go.
Well, I think what happened was, in the 40s, there was sensory research, but it was limited to vision, smell, sound. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about life. And now what's happened is sensory has become central to the passage from individual senses to quality of life. So we've tied together the science with the social impact, and it's made all the difference.
Well, isn't that where sort of the convergence of our behavioral perspective on sensory integration and the scientific work on multisensory integration really speaks to how that integration of information is central to functioning in daily life? I mean, you can't really communicate. I mean, the whole language domain and the research that they're doing on audiovisual integration and how central that is to communication abilities, really was not understood. It was a unisensory phenomena that were really being looked at as opposed to...
We weren't being holistic, really.
Right, yeah.
And if we take it right back to something really meaningful, we think about the newborn infant and how they first experience the love and security of their mother. It's through skin to skin.
Right.
And so can you say that skin to skin moment that we now know without a shadow of a doubt has immense value for organizing the brain, regulating the infant, supporting the bonding process? Can we say that's just tactile,
right,
or just emotional? And in fact, it's all the other things as well. And that's where there's this opportunity for this paradigm shift. And I feel like there's this momentum happening as we realize you can't silo these things out. And as all these domains of research come together to the same conclusion, sort of independently from one another, and then, lo and behold, sensory processing is central to human development. It must be understood, and it can't be separated out from relationships and emotion.
Right.
which some people have been saying for a while.
It's true.
And I mean, I think about that, and I think about that example of the infant bonding with the mother, and it makes me realize that maybe we need to take a step back in our discussion here and also just let's really clarify what sensory processing is.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think what happened in the beginning was people did accept that had a role with infancy, but no one realized for a long time that it goes across the age span, the lifespan.
Right.
And that sensory affects adults as much as it affects children.
And that's a huge part of the work that's been done under this roof, and with realizing how much it impacts adolescents and adults, and can be misunderstood throughout the lifespan.
Right. I mean, once you have sensory, you have emotion. And when people recognize the emotional sequela, they recognize emotional disorders, but they don't realize that how wrapped up it is with the sensory perceptions. And I think what's happening now is there's like a revolution of thought.
Agree.
That people who used to think autism and many of these other disorders were cognitive are now seeing the sensory basis for those other sensory systems.
So do you think that it's an awareness of going back really into an individual's history to understand the impact of various sensory experiences in what could be infancy, early childhood, that has actually colored the way they see the world, the way they interact with people? I mean, I think about the example of so many of our kids who are incredibly bright, and we work with them, or people are prone to work with them on that cognitive level, where really that social, sensory, emotional level hasn't been supported in the same way that those cognitive abilities have.
Right, and people have this debate, should we use top-down strategies,
Right.
or should we use bottom-up strategies? Should we be very cognitive? Should we be regulating the child? And then we're thinking, well, it's one brain. Let's do whole brain strategies. Let's make sure that we don't miss out either, right? And I think it's so interesting when we have conversations like this to think about how people have historically put things in buckets.
Right.
And we do as adults. You know, we go to the gym to move our bodies and to the counselor office and sit still to feel good about our emotions. And we do this over here and that over there. And we forget that maybe just a really good walk in nature while we're talking about these things, where we're doing it all at once, you know, could be just as profound and a lot more affordable. It's just interesting to be thinking about these things.
Yes.
I think, and you know, certainly this groundswell almost that we're talking about in terms of the recognition of the importance of a sensory foundation, I'm sure led to the recognition of sensory in the diagnostic criteria for autism, and you know, really seeing the profound impact of the sensory domains, I think, is also supporting a lot of where the research is going, because it's a feature of autism that actually, if intervened early, could have a really profound effect on some of the communication and social interaction symptoms.
Do you want to talk about that a bit, the DSM?
Sure.
yet?
Yeah. But before that, I was just thinking that Thomas Kuhn, said that the paradigm shift depends on people from different points of view coming from different places to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
And do you remember when we had that conversation about what types of science should be included to find out if SPD sensory processing disorder was a syndrome? And we found Bruce Pennington's
Model, yeah, yeah.
And he said you look at epidemiology, you look at developmental trends, age trends, you look at treatment effectiveness, you look at
I think divergent and convergent validity.
which is similarity and differences with other disorders.
Exactly.
And what is Alice's called? Prevalence epidemiology.
Yes.
I might have already said that. I don't remember. Anyway, there are 5 points. They're like a star,
Yes.
flat little model. And when we started to find people, well, we haven't talked about this yet, but when we started to find people to come into the scientific work group, we used Bruce Pennington's model, as a way of deciding what areas we wanted to stimulate research in.
Exactly, exactly. And just to diverge for 1 minute, because you're talking about something that I think is really huge from a historical perspective on this body of research, which was the funding that you were able to develop this scientific, from which you were able to develop this scientific work group, where you found researchers across the country who were interested in adding sensory to their already existing protocols, like Hill Goldsmith at University of Wisconsin in Madison, Elisa Marco at the University of California in San Francisco, Barry Stein, Margaret Bowman. I mean, the list is really endless. Alice Carter at Yale and at University of Massachusetts. But these were people who really wanted to understand this role of sensory.
Well,
and
actually, they didn't.
Some of them
well,
didn't,
yeah, right.
right?
Some of them
Right.
didn't want to.
They
Yeah,
already knew what caused autism. They already knew what caused other disorders as well, and they knew it. In fact, I had this argument with Alice Carter. She was
Right.
one of the first ones, and she said, "You don't want me to be one of the scientists in your work group because I know there's no such thing as sensory processing disorder. There's no sensory integration disorder." And I said, "Yeah, I want you because you're a respected scientist. Everyone knows your methods are good.
right.
And because of that, no, you don't want me. I'm going to find out what you don't want to know, which is it doesn't exist." And lo and behold, we found out that it did exist in a 10-year study.
Right, independent of other clinical disorders, that there were a population of kids who had sensory issues that could not be explained by any other DSM diagnosis.
And Hill Goldsmith was studying twins. He
Right.
studied 3,000 twin pairs, and he found there was a genetic predisposition, genetic component that needed. I mean, they were just so far from the clinical world that
Right.
we lived in, but they were such respected scientists that it gave real validity to the theories that we as OTs, bottom of the scientific model. We don't do that kind of science. What do? We work with people,
Right, but and then with the upcoming publications, I think, from John Fox and Sophie Mulholm, which are going to show differences in multisensory integration between individuals who just have sensory processing challenges versus those who have autism versus typically developing children. So I think, what you're really saying is that from that 20 years, there is a body of evidence that says this condition is real and it can exist. While the sensory dimension certainly impacts everybody and has been recognized in other clinical disorders, that there's a population of individuals who may not have any other clinical conditions, but that have these behavioral and physiological differences.
I think one of the most important things that I've learned is the difference between a dimension of function and a disorder. And I think that's worth talking about
huge,
for a
yeah,
minute.
yeah.
So a dimension is something that goes from low symptoms to high symptoms. So imagine that as a diagonal line that moves across space and time. A disorder is something that you either have it or you don't have it. So if you break your arm, you have an x-ray and it shows that you broke your arm and you have a broken arm. That's your classification. If you have SPD, you have sensory symptoms, but it's very interesting how your environmental context, your parents or family you live in, your educational context, all affects whether or not it presents as a disorder or not. So we can have the same level of sensory symptoms and I exhibit a disorder and you don't. So it's not just the number of sensory symptoms you have, because you picture yourself on a dimension, and I'm up here with quite a lot of sensory symptoms, and you're down here with not as many sensory symptoms, but both of us could have a disorder depending on how we react in normal life, in day-to-day life.
Yeah, and I think that brings it back to a point you made when we first started speaking, which really is, our concern is about when these features or styles of interacting or profiles or whatever terminology you want to use impacts a person's life
Function,
and quality of life, as you so well articulated, your relationships, your ability to go to work, to go to school, to have friends,
to have joy.
To enjoy other people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's really where when it's either crossing over to that point of disorder, or certainly when it needs attention to help and support an individual with.
And that is part of this paradigm shift that really changes how we support people. So that instead of trying to normalize people and make people look non-autistic, non-sensory, fit a certain template, we're helping them find their sense of self and find that joy and enjoy other people. And that's completely different to a lot of historical interventions and therapies.
And the therapy is success-based. It's not based on a formula that says you must do this with that type of person. It's you must help that person feel successful so that they can experience joie de vivre, joy in life.
And how you measure that is so different. So we have these research studies that measure extermination of behaviors, extinguishing behaviors, and then we have a whole different type of body of research trying to say we need to measure quality of life and joy that this person is able to contribute because they want to, because they get it, because they can enjoy their family, because they can have successful relationships. Which one of those is evidence-based? What are you measuring? And so I think that's a huge part of this shift into understanding people, is that it's to me it seems like so respectful of each individual's sense of self. And when we start thinking in these dimensions, and not just two-dimensional, but you mentioned space and time, and there's multiple sensory systems, you start to be talking about being comfortable with complexity. It's complicated, but also working as a team and coming together with a group of experts to help understand each individual, and then tailor-making what you do for the person that you meet.
Right, or the family, because it's really the individual within the context of their family, within the context of their community, because so much of the work that we do here at STAR, and I'm sure you can both speak to that more in the trenches than myself, but, is about a family understanding their own dynamics and how those dynamics are affected by their own sensory style, the unique style of their child, and their own personal history that they bring to all of the relationships that they have.
We had a very difficult family yesterday who has a child with a very complex disorder. And the whole team met, and they drew me in, which is kind of unusual, but I was really happy to be there because they said, does this child need therapy, psychological therapy? Does this child need OT? And the parents had very little money, so they could do maybe 5 or 6 sessions total. And I said, I think what we need to do is to maximize the impact of the time that we spend with them by working with the mother only. What are 5 sessions going to do for this kid? He is complicated. He needs 50 sessions, or 25 at least. But if we only have 5 or 6, let's work with the mother, let's educate the mother so she can go home and have a best chance of having an impact on the child. So it's a different way of thinking than take the child and fix him. Let's cure this.
And we had someone on one of our mentorships last year describe that as the dry cleaning model of therapy, and I thought that was brilliant. Like, I'll drop my kid off and I'll pick them up later, and
fix them in between.
Let's make them normal in between. And really being able to help people see a very, very different perspective on how we support our young people, our adolescents and our adults who have sensory processing challenges and experience the world in ways that we really can't presume to understand, but can try to help them unpack. I think that's a very, very big shift.
Well, we were talking about that website that has a definition for a neurotypical on it. where a person with autism, remember?
Yeah. So the disorder of being neurotypical,
Right.
where, you know, we have this inability to focus on one thing. We focus on multiple things to the detriment of our work product, and we care far too much about what other people think. And it's a problem, and it's a difficult thing to live with if you're on the autistic spectrum and you don't have those deficits. So starting to think about things differently, and I think that's core to the occupational therapy values as well, right? The minute we showed up at university to start studying occupational therapy, we were told to value the human being. Mm-hmm. And I love that fits so well with this current groundswell of thinking that's happening now.
And to consider all of the factors that are impacting on that individual, you know, that it's what they bring in terms of their internal factors and all of the external factors that are also need to be addressed, which really is what you were speaking to in terms of the parent and the family understanding and education.
And that they're bi-directional relationships, or they're open systems that impact each other, that have a cascading effect on development, and that brings tremendous promise for change if you're trying to support someone, but also it puts people at risk, and there is peril in that vulnerability that everything is connected. And starting to be comfortable with that means we have to be interdisciplinary, in my opinion.
At least in our thinking, better yet in our staff, but each person really needs to be interdisciplinarily trained, if that's the word. Interdisciplinary, I don't know.
And then we can recognize, you know, with comfort how this impacts that, and bring in the speech therapist, bring in the mental health professional, send for the geneticist and the psychiatrist and so on. And, you know, I mean, one day that will exist, right?
Yeah, but seeing the family at that center and that core. I mean, I keep going back to your the analogy of the dry cleaner, because I think it's worth stating again that this isn't an intervention that is just directed towards an individual, that this is not a drop-off pickup situation. I mean, I think that the role of the parent and that relationship is so core to certainly when we're working with children, and it may carry over into adolescents and adults in a different way, but I think, you know, it's worth restating how critical that is to the intervention approach.
The other thing that reminds me of is that intervention isn't always just with one person. You know, we have groups. We have how many? 10, 15 different types of groups going on, because once you're done with your individual therapy, you're not ready for a YMCA camp. You need an in-between experience that puts you in a group so you have social experiences, you can work through your issues with that before you're ready to be launched into the regular world. Because to be successful, you need to be scaffolded. You need to be helped to be successful.
Yeah.
And the best therapist is one who can stand back and watch what the child's doing and let them go to the point where they need a little bit of support.
Right, absolutely.
And that just right success.
And then just right success. And Ayers started this by looking at the Just Right Challenge. You know, she's very famous for that phrase, the Just Right Challenge. Therapy is all about the Just Right Challenge. And that was how we were all trained. But now the modus operandi is the Just Right Success. And it's such a great way to have kids come here and leave with joy.
Right, and I think it's one of those things, like, Ayers would have assumed that you would find the Just Right Success in the Just Right Challenge, like that's how you do it, but without spelling it out, other people maybe lose that sometimes, and we get too focused on the challenge part. And so adding that layer on, just you know, the spirit of this is the Just Right Success. I think that's really helpful. And it also reminds me, you know, we talked about how beautiful in the past watching the videos of Ayers with the children was, and the relationship she had with those children was exquisite to watch. And she was with them, she was in it, she was doing it. And again, I think that was an assumption of her treatment approach. You know, it's there from the beginning that it's
Yes.
relationship based, and it's a core value of occupational therapy. But now we're seeing the neurological value of that. We're able to measure that it makes things richer, more impactful, and we're spelling it out. We're making it explicit. You can't do this without that. The relationship has to be there with the sensation. And I love that.
And bringing the parent in to really be the driver of that
Closes that
within the
circle.
session, and
Huge.
coaching the parent to really, you know, I love the word that you bring to it, Lucy, the magic moments, you know, so
Beautiful,
that
yeah.
those are, you know, as a trained clinician, you excel, or we excel in that ability to get those moments of success with the child and the joy. But to be able to see a parent being able to have those moments, they're the ones that really need to have that shared joyful experience with their child as well.
That requires a lot of work, and I remember shifting towards bringing parents into my sessions.
It's scary at first.
And it requires effort, yeah. Like, I mean, you know, you hear a lot of people saying it's much easier if the parents wait outside. But where's that carryover, and what are you really impacting? And you know, we said in our frame of reference chapter, which is so exciting for us to have been able to publish, is that the greatest context of all that you can have impact on is the parent-child relationship when you're doing this work with the pediatric population. But it takes such a lot of effort as a therapist to get yourself to that place where you're being able to hold the parent in mind, the child in mind. The dyad is the client.
The relationship between the parent and the child is the client.
Is the client.
Not
Exactly.
the child, not the parent.
Right.
But how
The
they
dyad.
are in between. Yeah. I want to move on to the future and what we think is going to happen coming down the pike. But before we do that, you asked me a question, and I said I'll get to that later. What was that?
Well, we haven't really just unpacked what on earth we're talking about. Sensory processing disorder. What is it? How do we define it? What does it involve?
So that's a complicated question because it's a complicated disorder. It's not like breaking your arm. It involves everything, but the basis of it is sensory information comes into your brain, it's organized by your brain, and then there's some output. And when the children or adults or teens have this output, the output is not typical in the sense that it makes them unhappy. They end up screaming, they end up withdrawing, fight or flight responses, they end up looking and feeling very different from other people. And it's not that they're different from other people that matters, it's that they don't feel good. So they become scared of interacting with other people, they withdraw from friends. In fact, I think one of the most important ways of diagnosing sensory processing disorder is looking at the child's happiness with life. There's a sociological test where every child rates every other child in the classroom in terms of which ones do they like. And I think if we went in and looked at all those loners that are at the bottom, we could avoid a lot of the societal problems that we're seeing today. You know, yeah, we can do this complicated sensory processing test too, which will be exciting when that's done, but it's actually the unhappiness of the children that gets them into trouble.
So I think one of the things that you're saying is that the manifestations of underlying sensory challenges can look like a multiple different disorders. There are behavioral manifestations, there are attention manifestations, can be anxiety, depression, anger. I mean, there are a lot of attributes that I do think, if we're going to treat them from an occupational therapy perspective and we're using sensory strategies in combination with relationship and regulation strategies, that we need to know that there's an underlying sensory reason. Because there are other disorders that might be better treated, whether it's through medication or through cognitive behavioral strategies. I think that one of the things that we should be clear about is that we're doing an assessment so that we can link together an association that we hypothesize has the sensory features that are causing the child to have that degree of unhappiness and lack of quality of life.
And it's very hard to diagnose because it's hard to split out the sensory piece from the emotional piece or the behavioral piece. And I mean, it takes a long time to do the diagnosis, at least a few hours. You can't
Absolutely.
see them. You can't screen. People are always writing us saying, send us a screening that we can use. I'm a dentist in Poland and I want to screen my children. Send me a screening. Well, we can give them a parent report that they can use as a screening, but it's not a great screening tool. It's very hard to screen for sensory problems. You need to understand very complex dimensions of children and teens and adults.
Which, and that reminds me of what Steve Spielmann says in Neurotribes. He says nothing less than a total autobiography will do.
Yes, would we have that much time? But your point is very well taken, because I think people do rely on these report measures, and they certainly are at least a first path towards getting information, but we need to have multiple sources of information. We need to see the child and interact with the child over time, not just also in one 2-hour session or an hour or whatever that is. And I think what adds to the complexity is that there are multiple subtypes that we've identified, or at least characteristics that we see as sort of different manifestations. We're still obviously learning a lot more about how these different subtypes, whether the child doesn't like or has an adverse reaction to sensory input, or is slow or delayed to respond, or has these motor issues that makes it difficult to complete daily routines or organize themselves at school. I think the motor and sensory interactions and the unique features of each of those subtypes is still something that we're learning a lot about with the new tools that hopefully we'll have available.
And let's talk about those in a minute. But just to, I think it's something, so sort of some of the things that we're saying is sensory should always be brought to the table as a consideration.
Not just we are saying it. It's
No,
what's really
and
exciting.
that's what's great.
Yes.
Is that this is coming from multiple sources now. You have to think about sensory. You have to consider that this is a contributor, perhaps, to the challenges that you're seeing. And just describing the challenging behaviors isn't enough. So oppositional defiance disorder, great. Intermittent explosive disorder, okay, you're describing what's happening. Let's look at the root cause. And you have to consider sensory processing as perhaps one of the contributors, but also it's something that supports development. And so consider it as something that can be positive and bring about positive change, and should be built into our school days, should be considered in every setting throughout the lifespan. And then we're also, wanting people to know, and we haven't really emphasized this yet, that sensory processing is not just about being over-responsive to the world, although that's the most typically discussed presentation of it, is that things are too loud, too bright, too smelly, too intense. There's also under-responsivity, where you need more and more and more to get to that point where you can provide a response, you can register what's happening. But there's even more than that. It's more complicated than that. And you touched on that a little bit.
Right.
So there's the motor piece.
Right, so the postural piece, the ability to function against gravity, to have stability in moving through the world.
And many of our children we meet have not won the fight with gravity. Gravity is still in charge, right?
Yeah.
And that is everything. That's like an app on your iPhone, draining all the battery, draining all the power. You can't do anything else. You're not going to learn to read and write.
No, because you're focusing on balancing in your chair.
All that real estate in your brain is keeping you fighting this beast called gravity. So postural disorder is huge.
Right.
A huge part of sensory processing.
Have this really complicated construct, which is craving, or sensory seeking, or sensory craving. We have so much work to do on that. That's part of our future, is understanding
exploring that, investigating that aspect.
Right. And trying to understand, why is it that people need proprioception? Why is it they have to move and they have to bounce off balls? We have kids that spend their whole day holding their parents' parts, holding their leg. Hey, mom, well, I need to talk to you, and they can't not connect.
And so we think this is a small sort of subtype. We very much hypothesize that there's this group of children for whom no amount of sensory input will satiate that desire, that drive that they need to touch, feel, move. And in fact, that the more they get as they crave it, that they may get more dysregulated. They never get satiated. And so supporting that niche group of children, we want to find out what's going on. What's the neurological underpinnings of that, the neurobiology, what's going on?
So that's actually a theme moving forward, is to understand the neurobiological underpinnings of all these behaviors that fall in this category. And we want to understand the behaviors, we want to work on the therapy, but it comes together with understanding the neurobiology. And I think that's kind of a theme for moving forward.
Right, and the neurobiology may be very different given the subtype, and certainly a lot of the work has been done on the over-responsive, the too bright, the too loud, as you were just talking about. But that's where there needs to be more research and branching out into these other characteristics
And
of children.
my dream for the future is there would be funding. I mean, it goes without saying that you can't make progress with research if you have no funding. So OTs are not in a culture where funding has been a part of our experience, our learning how to get funding, our learning what is involved in being funded by NIH or the Department of Education at a federal level. This is something that's missing from our experience. And so maybe what we have to do is stop trying to get funding and hook up with people who know how to get funding.
I think it's fair to say occupational therapists aren't great salespeople.
No, they're just better at helping.
How do we pitch the importance of this? And hopefully as the paradigm shift happens,
I mean, I do think that there has already been a shift. I mean, I think there are some well-funded researchers who are looking at sensation. Certainly there needs to be a whole lot more.
And some of the treatment effectiveness studies that are coming out are really exciting.
And funded by NIH as well.
And funded, yeah. And I'm excited about the one that's coming out comparing sensory integration with ABA. And that's a huge study. Which university is that coming out of?
Well, Roseanne Schaff is the one of the individuals who was funded along with Sophie Mulhone and John Fox.
Albert Einstein.
Pretty exciting
Albert Einstein,
stuff.
yeah.
I'm really
But I
looking
didn't
forward
know they
to
were
that.
comparing it to ABA.
Is that right?
Yes, it is correct.
And then so if we go back to the nosology then there's motor-based disorders where your motor output is impacted as well as postural disorders.
And that was an area that Ayres was very involved in, was understanding what she called dyspraxia, its ability to motor plan and sequence, knowing how to play with toys, how to play a game, understand the rules of the game in the reciprocal interaction with another individual.
Yeah, and so that's a huge part here of how sensation helps us produce movements and behaviors. And then there's also the kids, the adults, the adolescents who have these discrimination challenges. So they know they're being touched, but where on earth in their body are they being touched and what does it mean? And those sorts of things. And by understanding that there's this variance in the way sensory processing and integration challenges present, we understand the need for these in-depth assessments. We need assessments, and we need a variety of assessments that will help us get to the bottom as much as we can of what's going on.
I mean, part of the problem with this disorder is how heterogeneous it is, how many different things come under. I think it's what's kept us from being funded. Is that
Interesting.
we don't have narrow little slots that we can describe that everybody will understand, because it's such a broad spectrum of things and the broad spectrum of individuals with all kinds of abilities and disabilities together that create the whole pattern of sensory processing.
The constellation, yeah.
And it's hard to get funded for something which is very diverse.
Yeah, it's a good point.
But it's exciting that you guys have been working for how many years on the SP3D?
16, 17 now.
16, I think. Yes. Well, 16 or 17, give or take.
Right.
Tell us about that.
So the SP3D is a sensory processing 3 dimensions SP3D scale, which is a very complicated and complex test because it looks at all these different factors. It looks at how they function in the real world, looks at what the parents think and can define, and then you actually administer a performance measure. An examiner, measures the child on all these different sensory attributes.
Very comprehensive.
Yes. And it takes a while. We're just standardizing it now. So Western Psychological Services is the publisher, and we're going nationwide trying to get about 3,000 children and adults tested by about 200 testers. So it's quite complex.
Quite the
project.
undertaking.
Yeah. But it's a lot better than being in the early stages when we were reviewing the literature and making charts of what we thought should be on the test. So it's all done, and now we're just trying to get the data.
And what sort of dreams do you have? What might we be able to do with this data? How might it deepen our understanding?
I think one of the areas certainly is being able to characterize, for lack of a better word, the subtypes, to understand a little bit more about the association maybe between some of these sensory-based motor disorders and what we're calling sensory modulation challenges, or this difficulty in regulating and grading your response to a sensory experience.
A second way that it's really going to be important is showing treatment effects. If you do treat the child, what do they get better on?
Yep.
And what can't we impact, and what can we impact, so we know what to expect.
And hopefully in that same vein, if the sensory processing is getting better, we'll be able to link it to these other performance areas of the child's life. Is it really changing their social interaction, and can we make that kind of association, which is really where AIRS began, was that these features are impacting on the child's ability to do their daily life activities, whether it's getting dressed in the morning or going to school or having a positive play date with a friend.
Oh, that's exciting.
And there are other tests that are being developed also.
And
not
we need
just
them all.
We need them all. They all measure things from different
Absolutely.
perspectives, and we're really excited to see these come out because there hasn't to this point been a way of measuring all these various things that we've been talking about all morning.
Yeah.
So that's part of our future for sure.
I think that's just I've said it already, but I think that's so exciting.
And another piece
So much to
is
look
being
forward to.
able to have the tools to do the research.
Yeah.
Everybody says, do research. Well, you can't just do research. You have to have a place to start. And to have various tools that have normative information so we know how people change over time and how to identify the disorder. I mean,
And how to create the homogeneous groups that you were referring to as well for
for
research.
studies, yeah.
Identify those. And then at the same time, there's this exciting improvement in technology. Then we can maybe be tying these things together.
One of the most exciting things are the wearables.
Right.
The Fitbit and all the Apple things, and that we will be able to use low-tech ways. We don't have to have a
That aren't
person in
as
a laboratory.
intrusive as they used to be.
Or expensive.
Right.
I mean, the laboratory studies that we did took hours per person. They were hard on the kids. They were hard on the adults, the parents having to watch the kids. But now you put a Fitbit or something like that, or you put a vest with markers in it on somebody, and you can get the data that you need to determine whether or not they change. It's perfect. And it will lead to studies in natural settings, on the playground,
Yeah, I love that.
at dinner time,
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really where we want to see the changes occur.
I'm looking forward to this. It's going to be great.
It will be.
And so, research is a huge part of what we do here. We also at STAR specifically have a really thriving treatment center with a really thriving adolescent and adult program that we're excited about as well.
Multidisciplinary.
It's I would say interdisciplinary, where we really talk to each other a lot and try to be really joined up. And then we also have our education department. And so that's, if we're talking about the future, something pretty exciting as well is, you know, we give away in treatment the magic moments to the parents, but we want to give away this understanding that's really current, that sensory processing and integration is central to human development, it's central to joy, it's central to quality of life and relationships. And so we want to be shouting that from the rooftops, really. And we've got the online platform, so hopefully we can have people around the world accessing training on the frame of reference and pieces like that. I think, I feel like, 2019 is opening this door for us.
It's when the ball goes up and it hit the top.
It's going to come down
Now
like
it's going
this.
to come down, and we're going to be able to share it with everybody, with all of you out there, and it's going to make it, we're making a difference. We're making a difference.
And so much of it is about the legacy that you have set up.
Thank you.
Your life's work has put us in this position, and getting that scientific work group going, being in the right time at the right place, but also being the embodiment of tenacity, Dr. Miller, if there's anything, and keeping this going. And so, to be able to think about the future as interdisciplinary.
Connecting, we've got to connect people to each
Connecting
other.
people, respectful, neurodivergent.
Yes.
The future is holistic. The future considers relationship and sensation. I think there's so much promise and excitement for where we're going, and what we want to share with everyone, really. And you always say it takes a village, and I think it's taken a village for this paradigm shift really to gain the momentum that it has. And so you called it.
It takes a village, and it takes villagers. It's the people that makes a difference, right?
Yeah.
So getting all the people on the bus that you need on the bus, the right people who feel like sharing is a good thing. They're not selfish with their knowledge. They don't feel if they tell a parent something, the parent won't need them anymore. Or if they tell a colleague something, the colleague won't need them anymore. So you share and you grow. And the village grows, and it keeps on growing. And that's going to be your future.
And really, I feel like you've built this community of constituents, of the star family around the world, people who've been to symposium, mentees, parents, advocates. What would you say to them as we go into
baby.
this? Go get them.
I'd say believe in yourself, because there's so much doubt out there still about, a paradigm shift is happening, but in order for the paradigm shift to become reality, you have to make it happen. You have to advocate for your child, yourself, or your mother, or whoever you're advocating for with this disorder, with these challenges. And you have to believe in yourself in order to do it. No matter what somebody says to you, just persist. Keep on there.